Lyra Ashford ran through the dark trees with her heart pounding against her ribs, the sealed letter clutched so tightly in her hand that the wax seal had begun to crack. Behind her, the forest of thornwood stretched endless and black, but ahead, past the last line of pines, stood the towering black stone walls of the Obsidian Keep, home to the most powerful and most feared ruler in the 9 territories. She was not supposed to be the one carrying this message. She was a courier, one of dozens, and on any normal day she delivered notes between farmers and merchants, nothing more important than a shipment count or a request for grain. But tonight, every senior courier in the pack had found some sudden excuse to disappear, leaving her standing alone in the message hall with a letter marked for the eyes of the Alpha King himself. She had asked why nobody else could take it. The answer she got was silence, and then a quiet, almost pitying look from the old clerk behind the desk. That look had followed her the entire journey, and now, standing at the edge of the tree line with the keep looming above her, she finally understood it. Nobody wanted to go near that place after dark. Nobody wanted to be near him. The guards at the gate barely looked at her twice. A courier was beneath their notice, a small moving shape in a gray cloak, easily waved through with a flick of a gloved hand. She walked the long stone path toward the main doors, trying to keep her steps steady, trying to remind herself that this was simple. Hand over the letter, leave. That was all this had ever needed to be. Inside, the keep was colder than she expected, the air carrying a strange stillness, as if the whole building were holding its breath. Torches lined the walls in long rows, their flames barely flickering, throwing long shadows across floors polished to a mirror shine. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, about the king who ruled not only as a man but as something far older and far more dangerous. A wolf, whose size and strength were spoken of in whispers, even among warriors twice her age. But of all the stories, one had always stood above the rest, repeated so many times, it had become something between legend and warning. It was said that 270 years ago, the king's wolf had thrown its rider from a high cliff during a battle, and that no living soul had been permitted to ride it since. Advisors had tried, warriors had tried, even the king's own betrothed, a noblewoman with bloodlines as old as the mountains themselves, had tried and failed, walking away with nothing but bruises and a wounded pride. The wolf simply would not allow it. It obeyed the king in every other way, fought at his side, guarded his lands. But the moment anyone attempted to approach it as a rider, it turned cold and distant, refusing to even meet their eyes. Lyra had never expected to see the wolf at all. Couriers were meant to hand their letters to a steward at the entrance hall, not walk into the throne room itself. But tonight, for reasons she did not understand, the steward who usually greeted messengers was nowhere to be found, and a tired-looking guard simply pointed her toward the great doors at the end of the corridor, muttering that the council was meeting late and the letter needed to reach them before morning. She pushed open the heavy doors herself, the sound echoing far louder than she wanted it to. The throne room stretched out before her, vast and dim, lit only by a ring of torches near the center. A handful of advisors stood in a loose circle, speaking in low, urgent voices about matters she did not understand, something about borders and grain shortages, and a delegation from the Eastern Territory. And there, seated slightly apart from them on a raised stone dais, was the wolf. It was larger than anything she had imagined, easily the size of a full-grown horse, its fur a deep, almost black gray, that seemed to drink in the torchlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes were closed, its massive head resting on its paws, utterly still, the picture of an animal that had long ago stopped expecting anything interesting to happen in this room. Lyra froze at the threshold, suddenly acutely aware of how small she must look standing there. An ordinary young woman, in a plain gray cloak, holding a single folded letter. She told herself to walk forward, to find whoever was in charge, hand over the message, and leave, before anyone noticed her nerves. She took one step, then another. The advisors continued their conversation, none of them sparing her a glance. She was almost to the edge of the circle when she felt it, a strange shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The wolf's eyes opened. She did not know it right away, because she was focused on the advisors, trying to work out which one she should approach. It was the sudden silence that made her look up, the way every voice in the room simply stopped at once. She followed their startled gazes, and found herself looking directly into a pair of eyes, the color of burning amber, fixed entirely on her. The wolf was standing now. She had not seen it rise, had not heard the shift of its weight, or the click of its claws against the stone floor, and yet there it was, no longer resting on the dais but standing at its edge, its head lowered slightly, its full attention locked onto her, as though nothing else in the room existed. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She had been warned, vaguely, by the old clerk, that the king's wolf did not react well to strangers, that it was best to avoid its notice entirely if possible. She had assumed that meant it would growl, perhaps bare its teeth, perhaps simply ignore her, the way it apparently ignored everyone. She had not expected this. One of the advisors, an older man with silver hair and a heavy fur cloak, took a hurried step forward, his hand raised as though he meant to call the wolf back. But before he could speak, the animal moved, crossing the space between the dais and the doorway in a handful of long, silent strides, and Lyra found herself standing perfectly still, too startled to run, as the massive creature stopped directly in front of her. Up close, it was even larger than she had first realized, its shoulders nearly level with her own, its breath warm against her face. She could see every detail of its fur, the way it caught the torchlight in shades of silver and charcoal, the faint white markings above its eyes. She should have been afraid. Every instinct told her she should be afraid. And yet, standing there, staring into those burning amber eyes, all she felt was a strange, quiet stillness, as though the entire world had narrowed down to this single moment. The wolf lowered its head and pressed its forehead gently against her shoulder. For a long moment, nobody in the room made a sound. Lyra stood frozen, the wolf's weight warm and solid against her, uncertain whether she was meant to move, to speak, to run. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast, and beneath it, strangely, the slow, steady breathing of the creature beside her, calm in a way that made no sense given everything she had just heard about it. Then the silver-haired advisor spoke, his voice tight with something between shock and alarm. He said a single word, quiet but urgent, directed not at Lyra, but at the doors behind the throne. Guards. He wanted guards. Lyra felt her stomach drop. Whatever was happening, it was clearly not something anyone in this room had expected, and from the tension rippling through the advisors now gathering closer, it was not something they welcomed either. She tried to step back, some instinct telling her that whatever this was, she wanted no part of it, that she had simply come to deliver a letter and now needed to leave before things grew worse. But the wolf did not move with her. Instead, it shifted its weight, positioning itself slightly in front of her, its body angled as though it meant to block her path to the door rather than let her retreat. Another set of doors opened at the far end of the hall, and Lyra heard footsteps, quick and purposeful, crossing the stone floor. She could not see who approached, her view blocked by the wolf's broad shoulders, but she heard the advisors straighten, heard the shift in the room, as everyone present turned their attention toward the newcomer. A voice cut through the tension, low and commanding, carrying an authority that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. "Explain this." She did not need to be told who had spoken. Only one person in this keep could silence a room with 2 words. Lyra swallowed hard, her mind racing through every possible explanation for why the king's wolf, untouched and unapproachable for 270 years, had just crossed a crowded throne room to press its head against the shoulder of a courier who had only meant to deliver a report and leave. She had no answer. She only knew, with a certainty that frightened her more than the wolf itself, that whatever had just happened, there was no simple way to undo it. The letter, still clutched in her free hand, suddenly felt like the least important thing in the room. She glanced down at the wolf beside her, its amber eyes still fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten, and for the first time since walking through the keep's front gates, she understood that this was not going to be a simple delivery after all. Something had shifted tonight, something old and long asleep, and she had somehow become the center of it without ever meaning to be. The footsteps stopped just a few paces away. Lyra lifted her eyes, past the wolf's shoulder, and found herself looking at the king for the first time, his expression unreadable, his gaze moving slowly between her and the animal at her side, as though he too were trying to make sense of something that should not have been possible. Nobody in the room moved, nobody spoke, and the wolf, silent and unmoving beside her, showed no sign of releasing her from whatever had just begun. The silence stretched so long that Lyra began to wonder if anyone would ever speak again. The king stood only a few paces away, his sharp gaze fixed on the wolf beside her, and for the first time she noticed how tired he looked beneath the authority in his posture, as though he carried a weight none of his advisors could see. His eyes, a deep and stormy gray, finally moved to her, studying her the way one might study a puzzle with a missing piece. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less commanding. Lyra found her throat had gone dry. "Lyra Ashford," she managed. "A courier, my lord. I was only bringing a report from the eastern outpost. I did not mean to disturb anything." The silver-haired advisor, whom she would later learn was called Edrin, stepped forward with visible unease. "My lord, this is highly irregular. The beast has not approached anyone in decades, let alone a stranger with no rank, no training, and no place in this hall." The king said nothing for a long moment, his attention returning to the wolf, who had not moved an inch from Lyra's side. She could feel the warmth radiating from its body, steady and calm, utterly unlike the tension crackling through the rest of the room. It was strange, she thought, how something so massive and powerful could feel, in that moment, almost protective rather than threatening. "Step back from her," the king said to the wolf, his tone firm, the kind of command that clearly expected instant obedience. The wolf did not move. Lyra watched the king's jaw tighten, watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like disbelief. He repeated the command, sharper this time, and still the wolf remained exactly where it was, its body angled slightly between Lyra and the rest of the room, as though it had appointed itself her guardian without asking permission from anyone, including its own king. Edrin exchanged a worried glance with the other advisors. "My lord," he said carefully, "in all the years I have served you, I have never once seen him refuse a direct command." The king's eyes narrowed, and Lyra felt the full weight of his attention shift back to her, sharper now, more searching. "What did you do?" he asked, though his tone suggested he did not truly believe she had done anything at all. "Nothing," she said quickly. "I swear it. I walked in. I was looking for someone to give the letter to, and then he simply came to me. I never touched him. I never even spoke to him." The king studied her for a long moment, and Lyra had the uncomfortable feeling that he was searching her face for any hint of deception, the way a man might search for a crack in a wall he knew should be solid. Whatever he found there seemed to trouble him further, rather than settle his suspicion. "Clear the hall," he said finally, addressing his advisors without looking away from her. "All of you. I will speak with the courier alone." The advisors hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave their king alone, with an untested stranger and an unpredictable wolf, but none of them argued. One by one they filed out through the side doors, casting curious and wary glances back at Lyra as they went, until only the king, the wolf, and Lyra remained in the vast, echoing hall. The moment the doors closed, the king's posture shifted slightly, some of the rigid formality easing from his shoulders, though his expression remained guarded. He walked closer, slow and deliberate, stopping only when he was near enough that Lyra had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "Every detail. Leave nothing out." Lyra recounted it as best she could, the walk into the hall, the advisors deep in conversation, the moment the wolf's eyes had opened and fixed on her from across the room. She described the way it had crossed the distance between them without a sound, the way it had lowered its head against her shoulder, as though greeting an old friend, rather than a stranger who had wandered in by mistake. As she spoke, she watched the king's face carefully, searching for some sign of what he was thinking, but his expression remained carefully composed, revealing little beyond a faint tightness around his eyes. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the wolf, who had settled onto the floor beside her, close enough that its flank pressed lightly against her leg, as though it had decided this was simply where it belonged now. "He has not allowed anyone near him like this in 270 years, the king said finally, his voice quieter, almost to himself. "Not since his last rider." Lyra hesitated, unsure if she was permitted to ask, but curiosity won out over caution. "What happened to his last rider, my lord?" Something shifted in the king's expression, quick and subtle, gone almost before she could name it. "He fell," the king said simply, his tone closing the subject as firmly as a door slamming shut. "During a battle. The wolf has refused every rider since." Lyra sensed there was far more to the story than those few careful words. But something in the king's face told her this was not a wound she was permitted to touch. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. She let the matter drop, though she filed the moment away, the flicker of pain quickly hidden behind a mask of composure. A small crack in the wall of a man who clearly worked very hard to appear untouchable. "I do not know why he chose me," she said instead. "I have no training. I am not a warrior. I am barely important enough to carry messages, if I am honest. This makes no sense." "A wolf does not choose without reason," the king said, though he sounded as though he were trying to convince himself as much as her, even if the reason is not yet clear to either of us. Lyra glanced down at the massive creature beside her, who had closed his eyes again, apparently entirely unbothered by the tension crackling between the two humans above him. She reached out, hesitant, and gently touched the fur along his shoulder. He did not flinch away, did not growl or shift, simply exhaled a slow breath, as though her touch was the most natural thing in the world. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, not entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. The king's expression grew serious again, the brief crack in his composure sealing shut once more. "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out. Until then, you will remain here, at the keep, under my protection. A bond such as this, if it is real, cannot simply be ignored. It affects him. It affects the pack. It affects a great many things you likely do not yet understand." Lyra felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She had come to deliver a single letter, expecting to be home before the following evening, back among the quiet, uneventful routines of her life as a courier. Now she was being told she would remain in the keep, tangled in something ancient and clearly dangerous, something that had already made powerful men uneasy within moments of witnessing it. "I have a life," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "A home. People who will wonder where I am." "I will see that word is sent," the king said, not unkindly, though there was no room for negotiation in his tone. "But you cannot leave. Not yet. Not until we understand what has happened here, and what it means for him." He nodded toward the wolf, who lifted his head briefly at the gesture, his amber eyes settling once more on Lyra, with a quiet, steady attention that she was beginning to realize she would need to grow used to. She did not know yet whether to be afraid of what had happened tonight, or something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. All she knew was that the letter she had come to deliver still sat forgotten in her hand, its message no longer the most important thing that had passed through these doors tonight. The king turned toward one of the side doors, pausing only to glance back at her once more, his expression unreadable. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we begin finding out exactly what kind of trouble you have brought into my hall, Lyra Ashford." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone with the wolf, the flickering torchlight, and the growing uneasy certainty that her simple errand had just become something far greater than she ever could have imagined. Morning came too quickly, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the stone floor of the small guest chamber, where Lyra had spent a restless night. She had barely slept, her mind circling endlessly around the events of the previous evening, the wolf's warm weight against her shoulder, the king's guarded eyes, the strange, unshakable feeling that her ordinary life had quietly ended the moment she stepped through those great doors. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. A young servant girl, no older than 16, stood waiting, with a simple gray tunic, and a message that she was expected in the training yard within the hour. Lyra dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling slightly with unfamiliar fastenings, and followed the servant through winding stone corridors, until they emerged into a wide-open courtyard, surrounded by high walls. The yard was already busy. A dozen warriors moved through drills in one corner, their movements sharp and practiced, while a small cluster of advisors stood near the entrance, watching her approach, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Edrin stood among them, his arms crossed, his gaze cool and assessing. The king emerged from a side passage a moment later, dressed simply now, without the heavy formal robes of the previous night, though his bearing remained just as commanding. The wolf walked beside him, and the instant its eyes found Lyra across the yard, it broke away from the king's side and crossed the distance to her, pressing close against her leg, the way it had the night before. Edrin cleared his throat. "My lord, if the bond is genuine, it should be tested properly. Not simply assumed." The king nodded slowly, his eyes on Lyra rather than his advisor. "Agreed. Lyra Ashford, You will undergo the trials given to any who claim a bond with a werewolf. If what happened last night was real, you will prove it. If it was some trick of circumstance, we will know that as well. Lyra's stomach dropped. Trials, my lord? I am a courier. I have never fought, never trained, never even held a sword. That, Edrin said with a thin smile that held no warmth, is precisely why this needs to be tested. The first trial was simple in concept and brutal in execution. She was to cross the length of the yard while the wolf remained tethered to a post at the far end, called only by her voice, with no physical contact allowed until he reached her. A dozen warriors watched from the sidelines, some clearly skeptical, others openly amused at the sight of an untrained courier attempting something that had broken far more capable people before her. She called his name, though she realized with a jolt of embarrassment that she did not actually know it. Nobody had told her. She turned toward the king, uncertain, and he seemed to understand immediately. His name is Kale, the king said quietly. Lyra turned back toward the wolf, tethered at the far end of the yard, and called his name for the first time. Kale. The wolf's ears lifted instantly. He strained against the rope holding him, and though the tether was thick and clearly meant to hold far stronger creatures, it snapped like dry kindling under the force of his sudden movement. He crossed the yard in seconds, ignoring the startled shouts of the warriors nearby, and came to a stop directly in front of her, pressing his head against her chest with the same gentle insistence as before. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Edrin's expression had shifted from skepticism to something closer to alarm. The king said nothing, though Lyra noticed his hands had curled slightly at his sides, as though he were resisting the urge to step forward himself. The second trial was harder. She was to mount him, something no rider had managed in 270 years, something warriors far stronger and far more experienced than her had attempted, and failed. Lyra stared at the wolf's broad back, easily as tall as her shoulder, and felt a fresh wave of doubt settle over her. I do not know how, she admitted quietly. You do not need to know how, the king said, his voice lower now, meant only for her. If the bond is real, he will guide you. She approached slowly, one hand resting against Kale's shoulder, and felt him lower himself slightly, an unmistakable invitation. She swallowed her fear and swung herself onto his back, expecting at any moment to be thrown, to feel the same violent refusal that had ended every previous attempt at bonding. Instead, Kale rose smoothly beneath her, steady and calm, as though he had carried riders every day of his long life, rather than refusing every single one for nearly 3 centuries. The yard fell utterly silent. Even the warriors who had been drilling in the corner stopped to stare. Lyra sat frozen atop the massive wolf, uncertain what to do next, until Kale took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, carrying her in a wide, careful circle around the yard, as though testing the weight of her presence. Impossible, she heard Edrin mutter under his breath, though his voice carried further than he likely intended. The king's face, when she finally dared to look at him, had lost all trace of its earlier composure. He stared at her, at Kale, at the sight of something he had clearly believed would never happen again, and for a brief moment, before he caught himself and smoothed his expression back into careful neutrality, she saw something raw and unguarded pass across his features. It looked almost like grief. The third and final trial was meant to test not obedience but instinct, a mock skirmish, designed to see whether the bond held under pressure rather than calm circumstances. 2 warriors, armed with padded training weapons, were to approach Lyra as though she were under threat, testing whether Kale would defend her the way a bonded wolf was meant to defend its rider. Lyra dismounted, her legs unsteady from the unfamiliar height, and stood at the center of the yard while the 2 warriors circled her from opposite sides. She understood, logically, that this was only a test, that the weapons were padded, and the warriors under strict orders not to cause real harm. But as they closed in, something instinctive and primal took over, and she found herself backing away, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kale moved before either warrior could get close. He placed himself directly between Lyra and the nearest attacker, a low sound building in his chest that made every warrior in the yard take an instinctive step back. When the second warrior tried to circle around from behind, Kale spun with impossible speed, positioning his body to keep Lyra fully shielded. his amber eyes fixed on the approaching threat, with an intensity that left no doubt about his intentions. "Enough," the king called out sharply, and the warriors immediately lowered their weapons and stepped back, clearly relieved to have an excuse to retreat. The yard remained quiet for a long moment afterward, the weight of what everyone had just witnessed settling over the gathered crowd. Lyra stood at the center of it all. Cale pressed close against her side, his breathing still fast from the sudden burst of protective energy, and felt the full, dizzying reality of her situation finally land. This was not a mistake. This was not some strange fluke that would resolve itself given enough time. Whatever had happened last night in the throne room was real, was lasting, and had just been proven beyond any reasonable doubt in front of the entire pack. Edrin approached the king with visible unease, keeping his voice low, though Lyra was close enough to catch fragments of the conversation anyway. Words like alliance and complication, and the council will not accept this, drifted toward her, carrying a weight of warning that made her stomach twist with fresh anxiety. The king did not respond to his advisor immediately. Instead, he crossed the yard toward Lyra, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, the same way she had the night before. Up close, she could see the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the faint lines of strain around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens carried alone for far too long. "It seems," he said quietly, "that you are not going home as quickly as either of us expected." Lyra glanced down at Cale, who gazed back up at her with an expression that, on a human face, she might have called content. "It seems I am not." The days that followed settled into a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. Lyra was given quarters in the eastern wing of the keep, far grander than anything she had ever known, though the luxury did little to ease the constant sense that she did not belong there. Every morning, she was expected to spend time with Cale, and increasingly, with the king himself, as the pack's healers and advisors worked to understand exactly what the bond meant and how it might be safely managed. She learned quickly that the king's name was Varric, though almost no one dared use it in her presence, addressing him instead with careful titles and formal distance. It struck her as lonely, in a way, that a man who ruled so much seemed to have so few people willing to simply speak to him as a person, rather than a symbol of authority. One afternoon, several days into her stay, she found herself walking the keep's private gardens alongside Cale, who had taken to following her almost everywhere, refusing to settle unless she was within sight. The gardens were quiet at that hour, most of the staff occupied elsewhere, and she was surprised to find Varric there as well, seated on a low stone bench near a small fountain, looking uncharacteristically unguarded. He did not notice her at first, his gaze fixed somewhere distant, lost in thoughts she could not begin to guess at. Cale, however, immediately trotted toward him, nudging his hand with a soft, familiar affection that suggested this was not the first time the two had shared quiet moments in this garden. Varric looked up, and for a brief moment, before his expression smoothed into its usual composure, Lyra caught a flicker of something raw and unguarded, the same flash of grief she had glimpsed during the trials. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, hesitating at the edge of the path. "You are not intruding," he said, gesturing toward the empty space on the bench beside him. "Cale clearly wishes for your company. It seems unwise to argue with him these days." She sat carefully, keeping a respectful distance, though Cale immediately closed the gap by settling himself across both their feet, apparently unconcerned with royal protocol. Lyra found herself smiling, despite the strangeness of the entire situation. "He has not been this settled in a very long time," Varric said quietly, watching Cale with an expression that was difficult to read. "Since before I became king, if I am honest." Lyra hesitated, unsure how far she was permitted to press, but the quiet openness of the moment gave her courage. "May I ask about his last rider? You do not have to answer. I only wondered, since he seems to trust so few people, and yet he trusted me almost instantly." Varric was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fountain, the water catching faint traces of afternoon light. "His name was Corin," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, though Lyra could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. "My brother." Lyra's breath caught. She had not expected that. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not know." "Few do," Varric admitted. "It is not something I speak of easily. Corin was Cale's rider long before I ever became king. back when our father still ruled. They were inseparable, the two of them, closer than most bonded pairs ever managed to become. When our father fell ill and the crown passed unexpectedly early, Corin insisted on riding at the front of every border conflict, determined to prove himself worthy of standing beside a king who was still, in many ways, only a boy, trying to hold together a fracturing pack. He paused, and Lyra waited, sensing there was more to the story, something he had clearly never allowed himself to fully speak aloud. There was a battle, he continued eventually, a conflict at the northern border that should have been simple, a show of strength rather than a true fight. But someone within our own ranks had other plans, a faction within the council, unhappy with how quickly power had shifted to someone they considered too young and too untested, saw an opportunity in the chaos of battle. Corin was pushed toward the cliffs during the fighting, deliberately, though it took years before I understood that truth rather than accepting it as simple misfortune. Cale tried to save him. He failed, and he has never forgiven himself, nor allowed himself to trust another rider since. Lyra felt her chest tighten with a mixture of sorrow and understanding, pieces of the wolf's long refusal finally beginning to make sense in ways she had not anticipated. "That is why he chose me," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud. "Not randomly. He has been waiting for someone he could trust, the way he trusted your brother." "Perhaps," Varric said, though his tone carried a caution that suggested he was not yet willing to fully believe it. "Or perhaps he simply recognized something in you that reminded him of a version of loyalty he lost long ago. Either way, it does not change the fact that you have now become entangled in something far larger than either of us intended." She studied his profile, the tension still visible in the set of his jaw despite the vulnerability of the moment, and found herself wanting, more than she expected, to ease some small part of the burden he so clearly carried alone. "What happened to the ones responsible?" she asked carefully. "For your brother's death." Something cold flickered across Varric's expression. "They were dealt with," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for further questions on the matter. "But their influence within the council did not entirely disappear with them. There are still those among my advisors who resent how quickly I rose to power, who would prefer a different king entirely, or at the very least, a king whose choices align more closely with their own ambitions." Lyra thought of Edrin's guarded expressions, the careful, calculating way he had watched her during the trials, and felt a small chill settle over her despite the warm afternoon sun. "Is that why they seem so unhappy about me being here?" she asked. "Not just because of tradition, but because of something more?" Varric's gaze finally shifted to meet hers directly, and she saw a flicker of genuine concern beneath his carefully composed exterior. "It is wiser," he said quietly, "that you remain cautious around the council for now. Not all of them mean you harm, but some, I suspect, will see your presence as a convenient excuse to challenge decisions they have long wished to challenge, using you as their reason rather than their true target." The warning settled uneasily in her chest, but before she could respond, Cale lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked toward the garden entrance, and let out a low, questioning sound. A moment later, a servant appeared at the edge of the path, bowing quickly, before delivering an urgent message that the council had convened early and required Varric's immediate presence. Varric rose from the bench, his composed mask sliding back into place so quickly that Lyra almost doubted the quiet vulnerability she had witnessed only moments before. He paused before leaving, glancing back at her, with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between gratitude and reluctance. "Thank you," he said simply, "for listening. I have not spoken of Corin's death so openly in a very long time." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing down the garden path with the same brisk, purposeful stride she had come to associate with his role as king. Lyra remained seated on the bench, Cale's warm weight still pressed against her feet, and found herself turning the conversation over in her mind, piecing together fragments of grief, guilt, and lingering danger that painted a far more complicated picture of the keep than she had first imagined. She reached down and gently stroked the fur along Cale's neck, and he leaned into her touch with a quiet, contented sigh, utterly unlike the guarded creature she had first encountered in the throne room. Whatever destiny had pulled her into this strange new life, she was beginning to understand that it was tied not only to an ancient bond between wolf and rider, but to old wounds, old betrayals, and a king who carried far more sorrow behind his authority than anyone in the keep seemed willing to acknowledge. For the first time since arriving, she felt something shift within her, a growing sense that she was no longer simply an unwilling participant swept into circumstances beyond her control, but someone who might, in some small way, matter to the outcome of whatever was still unfolding within these ancient stone walls. The council chamber doors slammed shut behind Varric with a heavy final sound, and Lyra stood outside in the corridor, uninvited but unwilling to simply walk away. She had followed at a distance, uneasy after their conversation in the garden, and now found herself pacing the stone hallway, while raised voices drifted faintly through the thick wooden doors. She could not make out individual words, only the general shape of the argument, tense and heated, punctuated occasionally by a sharper tone she recognized as Edrin's. Cale paced beside her, restless, his ears pinned back, clearly picking up on tension that Lyra could only guess at. After what felt like an eternity, the doors finally opened, and a stream of council members filed out, their expressions ranging from grim satisfaction to poorly disguised frustration. Edrin was among the last to emerge, and he paused when he saw her waiting there, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The courier," he said, his tone carrying a chill she had not heard from him before. Waiting outside doors meant for those with actual authority. How fitting. Lyra straightened her spine, refusing to let the comment rattle her outwardly, though her stomach twisted uncomfortably. "I only wished to know if the king was well," she said carefully. Edrin's expression shifted into something almost pitying. "The king," he said, "is currently attempting to convince a council of very reasonable men and women that a bond formed by chance, with a woman of no rank and no training, should be permitted to stand, despite the obvious complications it creates. You should prepare yourself, Miss Ashford, for the possibility that reason may eventually win over sentiment." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the corridor with a fresh wave of anxiety pressing against her chest. She did not have long to dwell on it, however, before Varric himself emerged from the chamber, his expression tightly controlled, but his eyes betraying a weariness that told her the meeting had not gone smoothly. He noticed her immediately, and something in his posture eased slightly at the sight of her, though the tension in his jaw remained. "Walk with me," he said quietly, and she fell into step beside him as they made their way toward a quieter corridor, away from the lingering council members. "They want the bond dissolved," he said, once they were alone, his voice low. "There are procedures for such things, rituals performed by the pack's oldest healers, meant to sever a connection before it fully settles. It is dangerous, for both wolf and rider, and rarely successful without lasting harm, but it exists as an option, and several members of the council are eager to see it attempted." Lyra felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "And what did you tell them?" she asked, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to know the answer. "I told them I would consider it," Varric admitted, his tone carrying obvious reluctance. "It was not the answer I wished to give, but outright refusal would have only deepened their suspicion that something beyond simple chance is influencing my judgment." Lyra absorbed this in silence for a moment, trying to steady the sudden rush of fear tightening in her chest. "Is that true?" she asked eventually, her voice quieter than she intended. "Is something influencing your judgment?" Varric stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite the seriousness of their conversation. "I do not fully understand what has changed since you arrived," he admitted finally, "but I know that dissolving this bond feels wrong to me, in a way I cannot easily explain to a council more concerned with alliances and appearances than with what is right for Cale, or for you." Before Lyra could respond, a quieter voice spoke up from behind them, and she turned to find a young woman approaching, dressed in the simple robes of a pack healer, her expression apologetic but urgent. "Forgive the interruption, my lord," the healer said, "but I bring word that Councilwoman Isolde has requested a private audience with Miss Ashford. She claims it concerns matters of safety rather than politics." Lyra glanced uncertainly toward Varric, uncertain whether this was a request she was permitted to refuse. His expression grew guarded at the mention of the councilwoman's name, though he did not forbid it outright. "Isolde has always been more sympathetic than most," he said carefully, though his tone carried a note of caution. "But be wary of anyone within these walls who offers help without explaining their reasons." Lyra nodded and followed the healer through a series of quieter corridors, away from the main chambers, until they reached a small private study lined with shelves of old books and dried herbs. A woman rose to greet her as she entered, older than Lyra had expected, with sharp eyes, and an air of quiet authority despite her gentle demeanor. "Thank you for coming," Isolde said, gesturing toward a chair. "I imagine this has been an overwhelming few days for you." "That would be an understatement," Lyra admitted, sitting carefully. Isolde studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I will be direct, since I imagine you have little patience left for careful diplomacy. There are those within the council who wish to see this bond dissolved not out of concern for tradition, but because they fear what it represents. A king whose wolf chooses freely, outside their careful arrangements and political alliances, is a king far harder to influence." Lyra frowned, absorbing the weight of this. "Are you saying I am in danger simply for being chosen?" Isolde's expression grew grave. "I am saying that history within these walls has not always been kind to those who threaten the council's careful balance of power, whether through malice or simple inconvenience. I tell you this not to frighten you needlessly, but because I believe you deserve to understand the full shape of the situation you have found yourself in, rather than navigating it blindly." Lyra thought of Varric's brother, of the betrayal that had cost him his life on a battlefield that should have been simple, and felt a chill settle deep in her bones. "You believe the same faction responsible for what happened to Corin might still pose a threat," she said slowly, testing the theory aloud. Isolde's silence, brief but telling, was answer enough. "I believe caution has served this pack well in the past," she said carefully. "And I believe you would be wise to trust very few people within these walls, until the truth of this bond, and its origins, becomes fully clear." Lyra left the meeting with far more questions than answers, her mind spinning with new fears, layered atop the ones she had already been carrying. She found Cale waiting for her just outside the study door, his ears immediately lifting at the sight of her, and she sank down beside him in the quiet corridor, grateful for his steady, warm presence amid the growing complexity of everything unfolding around her. She thought of Varric's guarded warning, of Isolde's careful revelations, of Edrin's cold dismissal, and realized that she was no longer simply caught between tradition and chance, but standing at the edge of something far more dangerous, tangled in old grievances and unfinished business that had never truly been resolved, only buried beneath 270 years of careful silence. Whatever came next, she understood now, would require far more caution than she had first assumed, and far more courage than she had ever needed, as a simple courier delivering routine reports across quiet forest paths. A full week passed before Lyra felt she truly began to understand the strange new rhythm of life within the keep. Mornings were spent training alongside Cale, learning the basics of riding under the careful guidance of an aging warrior named Cormac, one of the few remaining members of the pack old enough to remember the days when Corin had ridden the same wolf now bonded to her. Afternoons often found her wandering the gardens or the library, searching for any scrap of history that might explain more about the ancient bonding rituals, or the betrayal that had shaped so much of the keep's guarded atmosphere. It was during one such afternoon, buried among a stack of old records in a quiet corner of the library, that she first noticed a pattern that made her blood run cold. She had been searching for details about the northern border conflict that had claimed Corin's life, expecting to find a straightforward account of an unfortunate battlefield accident. Instead, she found inconsistencies scattered throughout the official records, small details that did not quite align with the story Varric had shared with her in the garden. According to the formal account, Corin had fallen during a chaotic retreat, pushed by the momentum of battle, rather than any deliberate hand. But a separate ledger, tucked away and clearly overlooked by whoever had filed the records, listed the names of warriors stationed near the cliffs that day, and one name in particular caught her attention. A warrior named Garrick, listed as having been positioned directly behind Corin during the retreat. A warrior whose name she recognized immediately from her time in the training yard. He was one of Edrin's most trusted men, someone she had seen standing close to the advisor on more than one occasion, always watching, always silent. She brought the discovery to Varric that evening, finding him alone in his private study, the same weary tension she had grown accustomed to seeing etched across his features. He listened carefully as she explained what she had found, his expression darkening with each detail she laid out. "I suspected something similar long ago," he admitted once she finished, though he made no move to touch the ledger she had brought with her. But suspicion without proof accomplishes nothing against a council skilled at protecting its own. If I accuse Edrin without solid evidence, I risk fracturing the pack entirely, especially now, with tensions already high over your presence here. Lyra felt frustration rising in her chest. So we simply do nothing? She asked, while the same people responsible for your brother's death continue serving on your council? Varric's jaw tightened. I did not say we do nothing, he corrected quietly. I said we must be careful. Reckless accusations will accomplish nothing but giving them the excuse they need to move against both of us more openly. Before Lyra could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Cormac entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. My lord, he said quickly, forgive the intrusion, but there has been an incident. Cale became agitated during the evening feeding, refusing to settle, and when the stable hands attempted to calm him, they discovered something concerning, tucked among his usual provisions. Varric rose immediately, his composed exterior cracking slightly beneath sudden alarm. What did they find? Cormac hesitated before answering, his eyes flickering briefly toward Lyra. A substance mixed into his feed, my lord, one commonly used to induce illness in large animals. Had he not refused to eat it, the healers believe it could have caused serious harm, perhaps worse. The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over all three of them. Lyra felt her stomach twist with a fresh wave of fear, not only for herself now, but for Cale, who had done nothing but offer loyalty and trust after centuries of careful isolation. Who had access to his feed? Varric asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Several stable hands, Cormac admitted reluctantly, along with anyone with sufficient authority to move freely through that section of the keep without drawing suspicion. I have already begun questioning the staff, but I suspect whoever arranged this took great care to avoid leaving an obvious trail. Varric's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment, Lyra glimpsed something fierce and dangerous beneath his usual careful composure, a reminder that beneath the king's diplomatic restraint lived someone entirely capable of ferocity when those he cared for were threatened. Increase the guard around him immediately, Varric ordered, and around Miss Ashford as well. If someone is willing to move against Cale directly, I will not risk assuming they consider her outside their reach. Cormac nodded and hurried from the room, leaving Varric and Lyra alone once more, amid the heavy silence that followed. Lyra found herself trembling slightly, the adrenaline of fear finally catching up with her now that the immediate crisis had passed. They are trying to remove the bond by force, she said quietly, working through the implications aloud. If Cale becomes ill, or worse, the entire situation resolves itself without anyone needing to openly challenge you or the council's rules regarding dissolution. Varric's expression grew grim. It appears so, he agreed. Which means, whoever is responsible is willing to risk far more than simple political maneuvering to see this bond ended. Lyra thought of Edrin's cold dismissal in the corridor, of Garrick's name buried within the old battle records, of Isolde's careful warning about the council's history of protecting its own interests through less than honorable means. The pieces were beginning to form a picture far darker than she had initially allowed herself to imagine, one that stretched back nearly 3 centuries and showed no sign of resolving itself peacefully. I want to help, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the conviction in her own voice. Not simply hide behind guards and hope the danger passes. If there is a way to uncover proof of what happened to Corin, and who is responsible for what happened tonight, I want to be part of finding it. Varric studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired gray eyes, a mixture of gratitude and reluctant admiration that he did not bother trying to hide. You are remarkably stubborn for a courier, he said finally, a faint, weary smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite the tension still gripping the room. I have been told that before, Lyra admitted, allowing herself a small, tired smile of her own. Very well, Varric said, his tone growing serious once more. But we proceed carefully, and we trust almost no one until we understand exactly how deep this threat extends. Beginning tomorrow, we will need allies within the council itself, people whose loyalty has not been compromised by old grievances or new ambitions. Lyra nodded, feeling a fresh resolve settle over her, despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. Whatever awaited them in the days ahead, She understood now that she was no longer simply a bystander, swept unwillingly into ancient politics and old wounds. She had become, whether she had chosen it or not, part of the effort to finally uncover the truth buried beneath 270 years of careful silence, and to protect not only herself, but the loyal, gentle creature who had chosen her without hesitation, and the guarded, grieving king, who was only now beginning to let her see who he truly was beneath the weight of his crown. The following days brought a careful, quiet campaign to identify allies within the council, though progress proved slower and more frustrating than either Lyra or Varric had hoped. Isolde agreed readily to help, her earlier warning proving to be a genuine offer of assistance rather than a veiled threat, and through her, they slowly identified a handful of other council members whose loyalty seemed to rest with the pack's well-being rather than personal ambition. But even with allies gathering, the danger surrounding Lyra only seemed to intensify. Guards now accompanied her everywhere, a constant reminder of the threat lurking somewhere within the keep's own walls, and Kale's feed was tested rigorously before every meal, a precaution that left the proud wolf visibly frustrated by the disruption to his usual routine. It was during a formal council session, called to address growing concerns about border tensions with a neighboring territory, that the true depth of the opposition finally revealed itself. Lyra had been permitted to attend at Varric's insistence, seated quietly near the back of the chamber, while the council debated matters of trade and defense. She noticed Edrin watching her throughout the session, his expression carefully neutral, though something calculating lingered behind his eyes that made her deeply uneasy. Near the end of the meeting, as the council prepared to adjourn, Edrin rose from his seat, addressing Varric with a formality that immediately set the room on edge. "My lord," he began, "before we conclude, there is a matter that cannot wait any longer. Serious allegations have reached my attention, allegations concerning Miss Ashford's conduct since arriving at the keep." Lyra's stomach dropped. Beside her, she felt Kale tense, a low growl building in his chest that she quickly quieted with a gentle hand against his fur. "What allegations?" Varric demanded, his tone sharp with warning. Edrin produced a folded document with the calm precision of a man who had planned this moment carefully. "It has come to my attention that Miss Ashford has been seen accessing restricted sections of the pack archives without proper authorization," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. "Sections containing sensitive information about past council decisions and confidential military records." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered council members. Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, torn between outrage and genuine fear, knowing that her research into Corin's death had indeed taken her into portions of the archive she likely should not have entered without permission. "Furthermore," Edrin continued, pressing his advantage, "several witnesses have come forward claiming Miss Ashford was seen in private conversation with individuals known to hold grievances against this council's authority. Given these circumstances, along with the deeply unusual nature of her sudden bond with the King's Wolf, I believe it is only reasonable to question whether her presence here serves some purpose beyond simple chance." Lyra rose from her seat, unable to remain silent while accusations of conspiracy were laid against her so publicly. "That is not true," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly with barely controlled anger. "I searched the archives because I wanted to understand what happened to Corin, because I believed, and still believe, that his death was not the accident everyone has been told to accept." The chamber fell utterly silent. Edrin's expression flickered, just briefly, something dangerous passing behind his composed mask before he recovered his careful neutrality. "A bold claim," he said smoothly, though Lyra caught the faint edge of unease beneath his controlled tone. "One with no evidence to support it, I imagine." "I have evidence," Lyra said, her voice growing steadier now, fueled by conviction rather than fear. "Records showing inconsistencies in the official account of the battle that claimed Corin's life. Records placing a warrior named Garrick directly behind him during the retreat, a warrior who has served under your command for many years, Counselor Edrin." The chamber erupted into hushed, urgent whispers. Edrin's face had gone pale, though he quickly masked it with practiced composure, his eyes narrowing into something far colder than before. "You accuse me of treason," he said quietly, dangerously, based on nothing more than old records misread by an untrained courier with no understanding of military archives. "I accuse you of nothing yet," Lyra shot back, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. But I believe the truth deserves a proper investigation, rather than being buried for another 270 years simply because it is convenient for certain members of this council. Varric rose slowly from his seat, and the entire chamber's attention shifted immediately toward him, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Councillor Edrin," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "If these records exist, as Miss Ashford claims, then a formal investigation is not simply reasonable, it is required. If you have nothing to hide, you should welcome the opportunity to clear your name." Edrin's jaw tightened visibly, though he inclined his head in reluctant agreement, clearly aware that refusing outright would only deepen suspicion against him. "Of course, my lord," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension radiating from his rigid posture. "I welcome any investigation that will finally put these baseless rumors to rest." The council session ended shortly after, though the tension lingering in the chamber remained thick and unresolved. Lyra left alongside Varric, Kale close at her side, her hands still trembling slightly from the confrontation she had never anticipated having to face so publicly. "That was reckless," Varric said quietly once they were alone in the corridor, though his tone carried more concern than anger. "Perhaps," Lyra admitted, "but I could not sit silently while he tried to paint me as some kind of conspirator. If we wait too long for careful, quiet proof, he will find a way to bury the truth entirely, the same way it seems to have been buried once already." Varric studied her for a long moment, something warm and admiring flickering behind his tired gray eyes despite the seriousness of the situation. "You may be right," he admitted eventually, "but we have made an enemy of him now, openly and unmistakably. Whatever caution remained between us has likely ended tonight." Lyra felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of his gaze, understanding all too well the danger of what she had just set into motion. "Then we had best move quickly," she said, "before he finds a way to move against us first." Kale let out a low sound beside her, almost like agreement, and pressed close against her side as they continued down the corridor together, the weight of the confrontation still hanging heavily in the air around them. Whatever fragile peace had existed within the keep before her arrival had clearly shattered entirely now, replaced by an open, dangerous rivalry that Lyra understood, with growing certainty, would not resolve itself without a confrontation far more serious than words exchanged across a crowded council chamber. 3 days after the confrontation in the council chamber, Isolde arrived at Lyra's quarters late in the evening, her expression carrying an urgency that immediately set Lyra on edge. She entered quickly, closing the door behind her before speaking, her voice lowered despite the privacy of the room. "I have found something," Isolde said without preamble. "Something that confirms far more than we initially suspected." She produced a small, worn journal, its leather cover cracked with age, and placed it carefully on the table between them. "This belonged to a healer who served this pack many decades ago," she explained. She recorded far more than simple medical observations. It seems she also documented rumors and suspicions circulating through the keep during the years following Corin's death, including detailed accounts of tension between the young king and certain members of his council who felt threatened by how quickly power had shifted away from their influence. Lyra opened the journal carefully, scanning the faded handwriting with growing fascination. Several pages detailed whispered conversations the healer had overheard, conversations suggesting that a faction within the council had grown deeply resentful of Corin's influence over the young king, fearing that his closeness to Varric threatened their own carefully cultivated positions of power. "There is more," Isolde continued, her voice growing quieter still. Further into the journal, she records a conversation she overheard shortly after the battle that claimed Corin's life, a conversation between 2 council members, discussing how convenient his death had proven, how it removed an obstacle before it could grow into a genuine threat to their authority. Lyra felt a cold certainty settle over her as she read the passage herself, the healer's careful, precise handwriting describing exactly the kind of calculated betrayal Varric had long suspected, but never been able to prove. "Does she name them?" Lyra asked, though she already suspected the answer. Isolde shook her head. She was cautious, understandably so, given what she had overheard, but she does describe them in enough detail that I believe we can identify them with reasonable certainty. One matches Edrin's description almost exactly, even down to a distinctive ring he still wears to this day. Lyra closed the journal slowly, her mind racing through the implications of what they had just uncovered. "We need to show this to Varric immediately," she said. They found him in his private study, working through reports by candlelight, his expression weary in the way it so often was during the quiet hours of evening. He listened intently as Isolde explained their discovery, his face growing increasingly grim as she read aloud the most damning passages from the old healer's journal. When she finished, silence settled heavily over the room. Varric's hands had curled into tight fists atop his desk, his jaw clenched with barely restrained fury. "I always suspected," he said quietly, his voice carrying a rawness Lyra had rarely heard from him. "But suspicion is not proof, and I told myself, for years, that perhaps I was simply searching for someone to blame, unable to accept that my brother's death might have truly been nothing more than terrible misfortune." "It was not misfortune," Lyra said gently, moving closer to where he sat. "It was betrayal, carefully planned and carefully hidden for 270 years. And now we finally have proof." Varric looked up at her, something fierce and grateful passing behind his tired eyes. "This is not yet enough for a formal accusation," he said carefully, though his tone carried a new resolve. "A journal filled with overheard rumors will not satisfy a council skilled at protecting its own, but it is enough to justify a deeper investigation, one Edrin will find far harder to dismiss, now that we have direction, rather than mere suspicion." Isolde nodded in agreement. "I can quietly gather further testimony from those who served during that time," she offered, discreetly, so as not to alert Edrin or his allies before we are ready to move openly against them. Varric agreed, and the three of them spent the following hour mapping out a careful plan, identifying old records to review, former warriors and staff members who might be willing to speak honestly about what they remembered from that distant, painful chapter of the Pack's history. It was slow, careful work, requiring patience that Lyra found difficult to maintain given the mounting danger she sensed closing in around them. Later that night, once Isolde had departed and the keep had settled into quiet stillness, Lyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind still racing through everything they had uncovered. She wandered toward the private garden, drawn by memories of the quiet conversation she and Varric had shared there weeks earlier, and found him already seated on the same stone bench, Kale resting peacefully at his feet. He looked up as she approached, offering a small, tired smile that carried none of his usual guarded formality. "I find I cannot sleep either," he admitted as she settled beside him, Kale immediately shifting to press against both their feet in his familiar, comforting way. "We are close to the truth now," Lyra said softly, watching moonlight ripple across the surface of the fountain. "Does that frighten you, or does it bring relief?" Varric considered the question carefully before answering. "Both," he admitted honestly. "I have carried this suspicion for so long that uncovering the truth feels almost unreal, as though I have been waiting for this moment, without truly believing it would ever arrive. But it also frightens me, because once the truth is fully known, there will be no way to undo what happens next. Edrin will not simply accept exposure quietly. Men who have hidden betrayal for centuries rarely go without a fight." Lyra reached out instinctively, resting her hand gently over his where it rested on the stone bench between them. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "you will not face it alone. Not this time." Varric turned his hand slowly beneath hers, his fingers curling gently around her own, and for a long, quiet moment neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken understanding settling comfortably between them in the still night air. Kale let out a soft, contented sigh at their feet, as though sensing the shift in the space between them, the slow, careful trust building not only between Wolf and Ryder, but between two people who had begun this journey as strangers, and were quickly becoming something far more significant to one another. "Thank you," Varric said finally, his voice quiet but sincere, "for staying, for choosing to fight for the truth, even when it would have been far easier for you to simply walk away from all of this, the moment danger became clear." "I could not walk away," Lyra admitted softly. "Not from Kale, not from the truth, and, if I am honest, not from you either." The words hung gently in the quiet night air between them, and though neither of them spoke further, something had clearly shifted, deepened, in the fragile, growing bond connecting the three of them together, Wolf, King, and Courier, bound now, not only by ancient instinct, but by a shared determination, to finally uncover the truth, buried, for far too long, beneath careful lies and calculated silence. The investigation moved quickly once Isolde began quietly gathering testimony from those who remembered the events surrounding Corin's death. Within days, 3 former warriors, now retired from active duty, came forward with accounts that closely matched the suspicions raised in the old healer's journal, each describing strange orders given during the battle that had never quite made sense at the time, orders that had conveniently placed Corin in a vulnerable position near the cliffs. Word of the growing investigation inevitably reached Edrin, and his response came far faster and far more aggressively than anyone had anticipated. Late one evening, while Lyra walked the eastern corridor toward her quarters with Kale at her side, she noticed 2 unfamiliar guards positioned near her door, their posture rigid and unfriendly, in a way that immediately raised her suspicion. Before she could react, one of them stepped forward, producing a formal decree bearing the council's seal. "Lyra Ashford," he said, his tone stiff and impersonal. "You are to be detained immediately, on suspicion of conspiring against the council through the spread of false accusations intended to destabilize this pack's leadership." Kale's reaction was immediate and fierce, a deep growl building in his chest as he positioned himself protectively between Lyra and the approaching guards, his amber eyes flashing with a warning that made both men hesitate visibly. "This is not lawful," Lyra said quickly, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Only the king holds authority to issue such an order. The council holds authority as well, in matters concerning threats to the pack's stability," the guard replied, though Lyra noticed a flicker of uncertainty behind his rigid composure. Before the situation could escalate further, Varric's voice cut sharply through the tense corridor, carrying an authority that immediately silenced the confrontation. "Stand down," he ordered, striding forward with Cormac close behind him, his expression thunderous. The guards hesitated, clearly caught between conflicting orders, before finally lowering the decree and stepping back, though their unease remained obvious. Varric took the document from the guard's hand, scanning it quickly, his jaw tightening with barely restrained fury as he reached the signature at its base. "Edrin," he said quietly, though the single word carried the weight of confirmation rather than surprise. "He has grown desperate," Cormac observed grimly, attempting to remove Miss Ashford before the investigation gathers enough momentum to expose him fully. Varric turned to the guards, his voice sharp with authority. "This decree holds no legal standing without my seal, alongside the council's. Return to your posts and inform whoever issued this order that any further attempt to act against Miss Ashford, without my direct authorization, will be treated as a direct challenge to my rule." The guards departed quickly, clearly relieved to escape the tension of the confrontation, leaving Lyra trembling slightly in the aftermath, though Kale's steady presence beside her offered some measure of comfort. Varric turned to her immediately, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his hand rising briefly, as though he meant to reach for her before catching himself. "I am fine," she assured him, though her voice carried a slight tremor she could not quite hide. "But this confirms it, does it not? Edrin knows we are close to proving his involvement, and he is willing to act openly against me now, rather than risk waiting any longer." Varric's expression grew grim. "It does," he agreed, "which means we can no longer afford to move carefully. We must confront him directly, and soon, before he finds a way to remove either of us permanently, rather than simply through political maneuvering." That evening, Varric called an emergency session of the full council, gathering every member within the grand hall despite the late hour. Lyra stood beside him as he addressed the assembled group. Kale pressed protectively against her side, while Isolde and the small group of loyal council members stood ready with the evidence they had carefully gathered over the preceding days. Edrin arrived last, his expression carefully composed, despite the obvious tension rippling through the chamber. "My lord," he began smoothly, "I understand there has been some confusion regarding a matter I addressed through proper council channels." "There was no confusion," Varric replied, his voice carrying a cold authority that silenced any further attempt at deflection. "There was an unlawful attempt to detain someone under my protection, orchestrated by a man growing increasingly desperate as evidence of his own guilt continues to surface." Edrin's composure flickered, just briefly, before he recovered his careful mask. "Guilt regarding what, exactly?" he asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Varric gestured, and Isolde stepped forward, presenting the gathered evidence to the full council: the old healer's journal, the testimony of the retired warriors, the battle records placing Garrick directly behind Corin during the fatal retreat. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the evidence mounted, piece by careful piece, painting an unmistakable picture of calculated betrayal stretching back nearly 3 centuries. Edrin's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack as council members around him shifted uneasily, their expressions growing increasingly suspicious as the weight of the evidence settled over the chamber. "This is circumstantial," he insisted, though his voice had grown noticeably strained. "Old rumors and misremembered testimony, nothing more." "And the ring," Lyra said suddenly, stepping forward despite the risk of speaking out of turn. The healer described a distinctive ring, worn by one of the men she overheard discussing Corin's death. "The same ring you wear on your right hand even now, Counselor Edrin." Every eye in the chamber turned toward Edrin's hand, where a ring bearing an unusual distinctive crest caught the torchlight, exactly as described in the old journal. His face drained of color, as the full weight of the evidence finally became undeniable, the careful composure he had maintained for so long finally shattering entirely. "You cannot prove anything," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence, growing instead into something close to panic. "We do not need to prove everything," Varric said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "We need only prove enough to warrant a formal trial, and I believe, given everything gathered here tonight, that threshold has been met entirely." Guards moved forward at Varric's signal, and Edrin, recognizing the futility of further denial, offered no resistance as they escorted him from the chamber, his carefully constructed authority crumbling entirely beneath the weight of truth finally brought into the light after 270 years of careful concealment. The chamber remained quiet long after his departure, the gathered council members absorbing the magnitude of what had just unfolded before them. Lyra felt Cale press closer against her side, his earlier tension easing slightly now that the immediate threat had been addressed, though she understood the full resolution of this long, painful chapter had only just begun. Varric turned to her, something profound and unguarded passing across his features as their eyes met across the quiet chamber. "It is over," he said softly, though his voice carried a mixture of relief and lingering grief. "Not entirely," Lyra replied gently, "but the truth is finally free. That is no small thing after so many years of silence." Cale let out a long, slow breath beside them, as though releasing a burden he too had carried for far longer than anyone had ever fully understood, and for the first time since Lyra had arrived at the keep, she felt the heavy weight of danger finally begin to lift, replaced by a fragile, cautious hope for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed Edrin's formal trial and conviction, a quiet, steady peace began to settle over the keep. The kind Lyra sensed had been absent from these halls for far longer than the 270 years since Corin's death. Garrick and the remaining members of the old faction were identified and removed from their positions, their influence over the council finally dismantled after generations of careful, hidden manipulation. Isolde, along with several other loyal council members, stepped forward to fill the resulting gaps in leadership, bringing with them a renewed sense of integrity that Varric welcomed with visible relief. Lyra found herself spending more time in the keep's gardens during those quiet weeks, often accompanied by Cale, who had grown steadily more relaxed and playful now that the shadow of old betrayal no longer hung so heavily over him. He had begun greeting other members of the pack with a warmth she had never witnessed during her first days at the keep, as though the resolution of his rider's death had finally allowed him to release a grief he had carried silently for centuries. Varric, too, seemed lighter, though the weight of leadership still rested firmly on his shoulders. He sought her out often during those weeks, their conversations gradually shifting from careful political strategy toward something quieter and more personal. Shared walks through the garden, quiet evenings discussing books from the keep's vast library, small moments that had nothing to do with danger or betrayal, and everything to do with simply enjoying one another's company. It was on a clear evening, several weeks after Edrin's trial, that Varric requested her presence in the throne room, the same grand hall where their unlikely bond had first begun. Lyra arrived to find it transformed, filled with warm candlelight rather than the flickering torches of that first tense evening, and gathered around its edges stood the full assembly of the pack, warriors, healers, council members, and staff, all watching with quiet anticipation as she made her way toward the center of the hall where Varric waited. Cale standing proudly at his side. "Lyra Ashford," Varric said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, though it lacked the formal coldness of that first meeting, replaced instead with warmth she had come to know well over the preceding weeks. 270 years ago, my brother Corin fell, and Cale refused every rider who came after, carrying a grief none of us fully understood until recently. You arrived here intending only to deliver a simple report, yet you were chosen, without hesitation, by a wolf who had trusted no one in nearly 3 centuries. He paused, and Lyra felt her heart racing as the entire hall watched, waiting. "I do not believe that was chance," Varric continued, his gray eyes steady and warm as they met hers. "I believe Cale recognized in you the same quiet loyalty and courage that once defined my brother, and in doing so, he led me toward someone who has since proven herself far braver, far wiser, and far more essential to this pack than any of us could have anticipated on that first strange night." He knelt then, before the entire assembled hall, and Lyra felt her breath catch as he continued, his voice steady despite the significance of the moment. "I ask you now, formally, before Cale and before my pack, to complete the bond, not only as his rider, but as my chosen mate, and as queen of these territories, should you choose to accept it." The hall remained utterly silent, every eye fixed on Lyra as she absorbed the weight of his words, the culmination of everything that had unfolded since that first fateful evening, when she had walked through the keep's doors intending only to deliver a letter and leave. She looked to Cale, who watched her with those familiar amber eyes, patient and trusting in a way that had never wavered since the moment he had first chosen her. "I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling within her chest. The hall erupted into warm, joyful sound, the assembled pack members cheering, as Varric rose and closed the distance between them, his hand finding hers with a gentle certainty that spoke of everything they had endured together to reach this moment. Cale let out a long, triumphant howl, a sound the older members of the pack later confirmed had not echoed through these halls since long before Corin's death, a sound of pure, unrestrained joy finally released after centuries of quiet mourning. The formal bonding ceremony took place 3 days later, conducted by the pack's eldest healer, beneath the open sky in the central courtyard, surrounded by the full gathering of the pack. Lyra stood beside Varric, Cale positioned proudly between them, as ancient words were spoken, sealing not only the bond between wolf and rider, but the union between King and the woman who had walked unknowingly into his life and changed everything that followed. When the ceremony concluded, Cale shifted his weight, lowering himself in clear invitation, and Lyra mounted him with practiced ease now, no longer the nervous, untrained courier of her first attempt weeks earlier. Varric shifted alongside them into his own wolf form, larger even than Cale, his fur a deep, striking black that gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, and together the 3 of them ran, out through the keep's great gates and into the open fields beyond, faster and freer than Cale had run in nearly 3 centuries. The pack watched from the walls as their king, his mate, and his loyal wolf disappeared into the distance, the long, painful shadow of old betrayal finally lifted entirely from the keep's ancient stones. Lyra felt the wind rushing past her, exhilarating and freeing in a way she had never experienced during her quiet years as a simple courier, and understood, with complete certainty, that whatever life had once been hers before that fateful evening was now inseparably woven into something far greater than she ever could have imagined. She had come to the Obsidian Keep, intending only to deliver a single report, expecting to return to her ordinary life within a day. Instead, she had uncovered a betrayal hidden for centuries, helped free a king and his wolf from grief that had shaped their lives for nearly 300 years, and found, in the process, a love and purpose she had never known she was searching for. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the open fields in brilliant shades of gold and amber, Cale let out another long, contented howl, echoed a moment later by Varric's own powerful voice beside them, and Lyra laughed, full and unrestrained, feeling for the first time in her life that she had finally found exactly where she was meant to be. The Alpha King's wolf had not run with a rider in 270 years. Now, at last, he ran free again, carrying not only his chosen rider, but the beginning of a new chapter for the entire pack, one built not on old fear and hidden betrayal, but on trust, courage, and a bond that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any grief the past 270 years had ever managed to bury.